This past Shabbat on the secular calendar was 9/11, 20th anniversary of the most lethal terrorist attack on American soil. Anyone old enough to remember that day will never forget where you were, what you were doing, and what you were thinking when you first heard the news. Personally, I had just showed up for my first day of internship at my social work internship for graduate school. I was working at a senior center in Washington Heights, New York. I was supposed to be there at 9 a.m., being the first day of work. I wanted to get there a few minutes early. I never got there early after that, but I did get there a few minutes early that first day. And as history has recorded, the first plane crashed into the North Tower at 8:46 a.m., probably as I was walking the few blocks from Yeshiva University to the senior center. The second plane crashed into the South Tower at 9:03 a.m. I was already at the center and watching the news. In many ways, the world changed that day and has never changed back. The way we go through airport security is just one, sometimes annoying example, felt by many of us. But while the actual events of 9/11 spanned little more than 2 hours, from the first attack until the last building crumbled, the legacy of that day continues to reverberate for many. The withdrawal from Afghanistan recently is just one example where the legacy of 9/11 and its aftermath continue to be debated. And as we know, servicemen and women continue to sacrifice their lives up until the very end of the American presence in Afghanistan. Just this week, there was a news item that 2 more 9/11 victims who perished at the World Trade Center were finally, after 20 years, positively identified by New York City's medical examiner's office. And still there are 1,106 people who died at the World Trade Center, but have yet to have any of their remains identified. The legacy of 9/11, from death to life. This week's People magazine featured 4 children of 9/11. Their pictures are on the covers on the top left of the source sheet. 9/11 children are young adults, 19 years old to be exact, who were born after September 11th, 2001, and whose fathers died on that day. There are approximately 100 such 9/11 children. This article in People magazine is just one of many that recounted where they are now and what they are doing, what they're up to 19 years later, 20 years later. And a common theme among all of those featured in this particular magazine article is that they don't want 9/11 to define entirely who they are. Of course, it will always be a part of them, but they also want to honor their fathers by living life to the fullest and building their own legacies, just as they have learned their beloved fathers did during their lifetimes. Take, for example, Jamie Gartenberg, who no doubt is named after her father, James Gartenberg, who died in Tower 1. She says that she learned from her father's story that, quote, you can't take life for granted. She also noted that her own family story and history, plus the experience of COVID for her and the entire world, has reminded her that our plans for life often don't work out the way we expected, and we somehow need to adapt and pivot and keep on living. Take Jamie herself, for example. Jamie was supposed to go to the University of Colorado last year for her freshman year of college, but due to COVID, decided to take a gap year in Israel. And her new plan is to enlist in the IDF as a lone soldier. Some of the impacts and effects of 9/11 were short-lived, but nonetheless exemplary and worthy of consideration and learning from. In her book, Paradise Built in Hell, The Extraordinary Communities That Arise in Disaster, the cover of which is in the middle of the first source of the source sheet, author Rebecca Solnit studied the impromptu, spontaneous, bottom-up responses to some of the worst disasters of the 20th century, some nature-made, some man-made, including the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, of course, 9/11, and Hurricane Katrina. And in each case, each of these events brought out the best in people, much more to a greater degree than it brought out the worst in people. 9/11 was a day that saw the effects of unimaginable evil, and that evil was the work of evil men. But it also brought out an unprecedented wave of altruism, mutual aid, and chesed by literally thousands of heroic men and women. There are so many stories of heroism. I'm recording this on Monday. Just last night, we had a 9/11 commemoration co-sponsored by JNF, organized by Isaac Kravitz, where we heard stories of heroism from among our members, both who were there and telling stories of others of that fateful day. One story that I'd like to share, perhaps one of the more notable, yet not well known, acts of valor that occurred on September 11th, 2001, was the maritime evacuation of Lower Manhattan, the largest water evacuation in American history, where 500,000 people, 500,000 people, were transported to safety in approximately 9 hours by literally hundreds of vessels that answered the call from the US Coast Guard to converge on New York Harbor to aid in the evacuation. Stories of fishermen who broke into yachts, knowing that yacht owners usually leave their keys right by the ignition, taking the boat, saving people, having hundreds jump on, dozens jump on, and then returning the boat after they were done with their work. And in her book, Rebecca Solnit quotes Professor Charles Fritz, who helped lead the University of Chicago's disaster research project in the 1950s. Conventional wisdom tells us that disasters often bring out the worst in people. Think lootings or shootings when the electricity is out and when the stores are open and vulnerable. Or perhaps think about the hoarding that we saw go on at the beginning of COVID, of toilet paper and hand sanitizer. Certainly not our best moment, certainly not done by our best angels. But however people might think that disasters bring out the worst in people, the opposite is much more common. I quote from Professor Charles Fritz, quote, "The widespread sharing of danger, loss, and deprivation produces intimate, primarily group solidarity among the survivors, which overcomes social isolation, provides a channel for intimate communication and expression, and provides a major source of physical and emotional support and reassurance. Survivors often feel a feeling of belonging and a sense of unity, rarely achieved under normal circumstances. Everyone understands that in these intense moments, solidarity and altruism may just be a temporary utopian society. It may be fleeting, it may not last very long. Nonetheless, it teaches us something important about who we can be, about the human ability to respond to challenge in positive and constructive ways. In each of the cases, the utopia wore off, sometimes after days or weeks, maybe months, but it's not forever. This strong sense of unity, patriotism in the case of 9/11, altruism, many people go back to relatively normal and maybe even selfish lives. For other survivors, the events of 9/11 continue to challenge them even 20 years later. One such person I want to bring to your attention is Virginia Jeannie Buckingham. She was the head of Boston's Logan Airport on 9/11. She was a rather young appointee of the governor of Massachusetts, for whom she worked as chief of staff. And of course, Boston's Logan Airport was the takeoff city of the two planes that crashed into New York. After 9/11, many people, in their shock and then in their grief, also looked to blame someone, including the media, politicians, and even some families of victims. And they focused in on Logan Airport in general and Buckingham in particular for a, quote, failure to warn the victims and a failure to prevent the terrorists from boarding their flights and doing their dastardly deeds. Never mind, of course, that this was pre-TSA when the airlines were responsible for safety measures at the terminal and not the airports. Never mind that it was a time when the focus was on customer service. They would pride themselves, the airlines, that you can get to the airport a mere 30 minutes before departure and get comfortably into your seat in time for takeoff. They weren't focused on security. That was way far down the list. Who could have ever imagined? Never mind that Logan's security was the same or better than the security of all other US airports. In the aftermath of an unprecedented catastrophe like 9/11, people want to find a scapegoat, someone they can blame so that they can feel more secure. And once that this person or this problem has been taken care of, once this person is out of the way, they've been fired. Now, so everyone else no longer has to worry about this catastrophe ever happening again, somehow taking control of it. Now they can go on living their lives as they had before. Of course, that's not reality. But soon after the attacks, in fact, Virginia Buckingham was asked to resign. She was sued personally by a couple of families who wanted to find her responsible herself. This led Buckingham to question herself. Maybe I am guilty. Maybe I should have known about the threat. And my failure to warn and my failure to prevent is in fact a sin. In her memoir, On My Watch, which the cover is to the right of the source sheet at the top, Buckingham tells her story of trauma, grief, depression, and recovery. She warns us about the tendency and danger of scapegoating, putting the Yom Kippur Sir HaMishtaleach scapegoat aside, not today's shir. Ultimately, the 9/11 Commission found that Logan Airport was as secure as every other US airport. And the terrorists just happened to choose Logan, but they could have chosen any other departure city. Both the airport and Jeannie Buckingham were found to be blameless, and the lawsuits were ultimately dismissed. However, this did not lead Virginia to immediately clear her conscience, to completely forgive herself, to allow herself to move on. In fact, as she puts it in her memoir, she can never move on. Many people can never move on. All she can do is not move on, but move forward. She does not expect to ever fully recover from her experience. She hopes that she can use those experiences to grow and become a better person. Buckingham lives in Marblehead, Massachusetts, a coastal town. And due to her many walks along the shore, she came to see herself like a piece of sea glass. Quote, sea glass comes from a broken bottle that the sea has tossed about. It's completely unrecognizable from what it started as, but it still has value. It's still beautiful. Sea glass starts with jagged edges from something that was broken. And over time, over the tide and the waves, over many, many years, if not decades, the jagged edges, the rough edges, the breaks are smoothed out, and it has a new life as a beautiful, beautiful artifact. Through these examples, the heroism of the day, the children of 9/11, Jeannie Buckingham, there's a common theme that emerges throughout. And that theme that I'd like to spend time learning about, speaking about this Shabbat Shuva drasha is resilience. Resilience. Merriam-Webster Dictionary offers two definitions for resilience. One is the capacity of a strained body to recover its size and shape after deforming caused especially by compressive stress. Think about a semi-inflated basketball that you punch and it goes concave and you push underneath it and then it returns. That ball is resilient. It can bounce back to exactly the way it was. The next definition is an ability to recover from or adjust easily to misfortune or change. There's a difference in these resiliences. One resilience is the ability to bounce back exactly as you were, as it was. The other resilience is the ability to adjust in order to survive, if not thrive. I think there's an important difference, and for our purposes, we're going to really focus on the second type of resilience, the ability to navigate and to change, to adjust to misfortune or change, to difficulties that we come across. Sherry Mandel, the mother of Kobe, a young boy, 13 years old, who was brutally murdered by terrorists in Israel many years ago, along with his friend, she wrote a book about resilience. And in a subsequent article, she wrote, quote, in Hebrew, the word designating resilience, and this is important for us in our day and age, is chosen, which means to inoculate, a vaccine, to be impermeable, to be completely protected. But none of these terms describe the Jewish concept of resilience, says Sherry Mandel. Judaism teaches us that we always need to become greater, bigger, better, adjusted as a result of the challenges. You have to expand in order to be able to contain the new you, shattered though you may feel. Sherry Mandel says something that I mentioned in my Rosh Hashanah drasha: resilience is about becoming. It's about becoming, not overcoming. When you face a trauma, you are in danger of breaking apart. You may even fear that you will lose your mind. Yet that same sense of vulnerability and fracture can lead you toward connecting to something greater than yourself, connecting to others, connecting to the divine. We're going to come back to that at the end of our shir. And Sherry Mandel concludes by noting resilience is connected to the word for silence and for salience. What silenced you, what felt beyond language, now propels you to find salience, a heightened sense of meaning and significance, a deeper conversation with God. This, my friends, is what resilience is all about. And resilience is an incredibly important concept in Judaism, an incredibly important concept for our Tishrei and high holiday season, yet beginning before Tishrei during Elul, and throughout this season through Sukkot. Of course, resilience is in the face of a difficulty, a challenge, whether it's an internal challenge or one that is thrust upon us externally. And what greater challenge do we as Jews look to than the challenge presented to our forefather Avraham, the first Jew, the father of the Jewish people, Avraham Ivri, and his challenge, his nisayon, his test being Akedat Yitzchak. We refer to Akedat Yitzchak already yet in the Slichot. In the Slichot, there's a type of Slicha referred to as the Akedah, which makes mention of the original Akedat Yitzchak, binding of Isaac, but also many other instances throughout history of martyrdom, where Jews were forced or chose to give up their lives in order to sanctify God's name. And all of those piyutim and poems that speak of martyrology, martyrdom, are referred to as akedas, an akeda type poem. Of course, we find in the Machzor, Od Yizkar Lanu Avat Eitan Adonenu Ben Hanekad Ashmit Midainenu. Whenever we refer to, we make reference to Avraham and his test, Misha Anal Avram Avinu Bahar Moriah, the God that answered Avraham, the God that enabled Avraham and Yitzchak to withstand the test and to be resilient in the aftermath of the test, throughout the test, should answer us in our time and give us the strength to be resilient as well. What do we know about that test? Well, if you continue on the source sheet under Nisayon, Piska 40 suggests that that the test, the Akedat Yitzchak, took place on Rosh Hashanah. We refer to Akedat Yitzchak many times on Rosh Hashanah, especially the shofar. Shofar corresponds to the ram that was offered in the place of Isaac at the Akedah. But the Piska says that Avram, after the Akedah, names the location of Har HaMoriah Hashem Yireh, because the pasuk says Asher Yemer Hayom Har Hashem Yireh, because today Hayom, God can be seen, because that's what Avram experienced that day. He names the place Har HaMoriah or something similar. The word Hayom, wherever we find the word Hayom, or many times throughout Chazal, connected to Hayom Harat Olam. Hayom is a code word in Medrash, in the homiletic material, throughout the ages to Rosh Hashanah. Therefore, the Piska says that Akedat Yitzchak occurred on Rosh Hashanah. The Mata Yehuda source, the second source on the sheet, suggests a tradition that Akedat Yitzchak took place on Yom Kippur. And we refer to Akedat Yitzchak on Yom Kippur. We even refer to the ashes of Isaac. Because Isaac was willing to sacrifice himself, we view it as if it happened, even though it didn't. And in God's eye, there are ashes of Isaac that come and serve as a merit, as a schut to the Jewish people, especially on Yom Kippur, at the Day of Judgment. Rabbeinu Bachya tells us that the Akedah was the hardest of the tests, but certainly not the only test. It was unique, but it was the culmination of many tests. We talk about 10 tests. The Mishnah Pirkei Avot tells us there were 10 tests. Rashi quotes that tradition as well. We'll come to the number 10 in a moment. But I just want to note with Rabbeinu Bachya and others that tests build upon themselves, right? We're tested in one way. It's not the same test throughout our lives. The idea of growth and resilience is that once you're tested once and you pass that test, even if it comes up again, your task is to find something else with which to be tested. And that's the idea of Rabbeinu Bachya, that the Akedah was the hardest test, but it wasn't the first test, because Avram had to be resilient and overcome and traverse all the other tests. We're going to talk in a little bit, what does it mean to pass a test? Does it mean that you win? Does it mean that you're done with it? Does it mean that you live to fight another day? Are there tests that come up over and over again? Even if they do, there are different tests like Avram had at different stages of his life, and they build one upon the other. Success leads to the possibility of confronting a new test or maybe an old test in a different way. The idea, why is it 10? 10 tests, just like the Mishnah also tells us there were 10 plagues and there were 10 utterances, Asar Mamarot, that God used to create the world. Vayomer Hashem, 10 times in the Genesis story. What does 10 mean? So the Maharal tells us that 10 means from A to Z, from Alf to Tav, everything, every conceivable form of test. That's what Avram had. And the idea being is that the very same circumstance and its opposite are both tests, can be both tests. We'll see later that poverty is for sure a test, but wealth can also be a test. Arrogance is a test, but humility could be a test. Anger could be a test, but being docile could also be a test. If you're not, the lack of passion is a test, but being too passionate is a test. And the idea that Avram confronted and passed 10 tests is the idea that Avram had experienced lots of different tests. The test of being childless, the test of having to deal with his children, both Yitzchak and Yishmael. The entire gamut. As the Maharal says, after you get to 10, you just repeat ones, 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3. 10 shows the entire spectrum of Nisyonot. Now there are three, what's the purpose of a test? What, if we're trying to be resilient and looking for meaning in the test, sometimes it's easy, and certainly in the midst of a test, it's very difficult. But when we're not dealing with tests and we're learning about it, like today, like right now, how do we understand the purpose of a test? The Medrash Rabbah offers three. Medrash Rabbah, Bereshit Rabbah 32:3, offers three parables, each one of them teaching us a different element of what it means to experience a test and withstand that test, right? Number one, Rabbi Yonatan says it's like a pottery seller who's hawking his wares on the side of the shuk, and he wants to demonstrate how strong his pottery is, so he bangs on it. Maybe he even bangs on it with a hammer to show that it's not going to break, right? It's like remember the infomercials of the Master Chef, some sort of chef knives. You can cut through a piece of brick, and then you can slice a tomato all day long, right? You want to show it. You want to show the durability, the versatility, the strength of the item or the person, and you want to show it to others. Right? So that's one type. You're demonstrating what's already there. And when it comes to a human being being tested, that demonstration of a test could be either to prove to the person being tested how strong and resilient she or he can be, or maybe it's to show others that through others seeing how tested the person is, they find strength and lessons through that test. The second example, Rabbi Yossi gives a parable of a flax worker who he stretches and smacks the flax. And in this case, smacking the flax and hitting the flax, testing the flax, is not just to show what it is, but to make it more hardy, to make it more durable. That's how you bring out what's potentially within the flax. It's not there yet. It only comes out through the hitting, through the testing. That's a different type of test. It's not about showing what's already there, but it's about strengthening and creating something as a result of the test. A person is tested, and I never knew I could do X until I was tested. I never knew I had it in me until I was tested. Lahotzi min hakoach el hapoel, in order to bring to fruition what's in potential into reality. And the last example we have is Rabbi Lazar. He says it's like if you have a heavy load and you have two oxen, one's strong and one's weaker. So you give the heavier burden, the heavier load to the stronger ox. And this is the idea of tests. This is the idea that in the world, God has a plan. We don't understand it because we are finite and God is infinite. But part of that plan entails certain challenges that are brought to the world, brought to the universe. And who does God test more? Those who are stronger. So, and we'll come back to this idea that if you're being tested by something, it means that you are meant to be able to withstand it. It may not be easy, and it may require effort, and you may fall at first. But God tests that come to you without you asking for it, and that's another point, are there because they are surmountable, and you are meant to somehow be resilient in the face of that, challenge. I want to go back to one point that we had mentioned before about how Avram built from one test to the next until he reached the ultimate test of the Akedah, the 10 tests spanning the entire spectrum. Well, there's another idea of when you pass a test, what does that mean? Well, you may be tested in that again, but I'd like to share with you an idea from Leo Dessler, from Mechtom Eliyahu. He talks about the Nekudat HaBechira. What that means is that every time we're tested and we pass the test, the next time, if it becomes natural to us, then what was once a decision is no longer a decision, and we have a more sophisticated, developed, different decision to make. The example that I like to give is maybe there was a point in our lives where we didn't put on tefillin every day. And now we put on tefillin every day. So now that's not a choice. Of course, it's a choice. In theory, I might not, but it's become a habit, a very strong habit, a part of my routine. And that's not even a question. Of course, I'm going to put on tefillin. What's the question? Am I going to daven 3 times a day? That I don't do all the time. That's my Nekudat HaBechira. I've raised it from the question of whether I put on tefillin to a question of whether I'm going to pray 3 times a day. And maybe I'm a person that I've got it in me that I'm going to pray 3 times a day. And now my question is, am I going to go to Minyan for one of those prayer services? I've elevated some things that had once been a question are now a given, and now I have different tests and different questions that need to be answered. These 3, just to point out the second to last source on page 1, the Malbim says the difference between a bechina and an isayon very much relates to the second type of test quoted in the name of Rav Yosef ben Chanina mentioned in the Breshit Rabbah. It says when you have a test in school, it's called a bechina. The teacher wants to know what you already know, right? He's determining what's already there, what's in your head. What can you explain? What can you define? An isayon is bringing to fruition something that's within the nature, but has not yet been tested, has not been proven yet. That's here too. It's the idea of bringing potential into actuality, bringing something that could be there into being known to be there. Similar to this idea, the Gemara Menachot says, "Amar Rav Yochanan," last source on page 1. Lamanim shel Yisrael zayit. I mentioned this lesson on Tu B'Shvat, at the Tu B'Shvat Seder, when we pick up an olive and look at it and eat it and talk about it, right? The Jewish people are compared to olives. Why? Ma zayit eno motzi mimen shmono el alidei ketita, af Yisrael ein chozun l'mutav el alidei yisurin. That just as the best of an olive is olive oil only comes out when you put a little squeeze on the olive, a little pressure, a little challenge. Only then do you see the olive oil, which is the most valuable part of it. So to the Jewish people, their best is brought out when they are put under the squeeze, when there's a little bit of an isayon, similar to that second idea in Breshit Rabbah. And similar to the first idea of Breshit Rabbah, the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim says that the purpose of every test is so that the event which forms the actual trial is not the end desire. It is but an example for our instruction and guidance. Top of page 2, Moreh Nevuchim, chapter 3rd book, chapter 24. It's to learn from. It's to be a teachable moment, an example for others to follow. Right? Again, we may not want the test, right? And we may not choose to be tested, but once we're there, perhaps these 3 approaches can provide some meaning and help us navigate as we try to be resilient. The Rav Sajagon, which is the second source on page 2, I think Tatu Tvunot, says Hashem Tzaddik Yivchan. God tests the righteous, right? Just because you're tested doesn't mean you're wicked. It's not a punishment. It could be a test. And God tests the righteous, right? And Rav Sajagon just points out, God doesn't test people who can't handle it. There is no point of testing someone who's going to fail. who's going to for sure fail. We might fail, but if we're tested, and again, if we didn't ask for the test, it came our way without it asking for it, either an internal test or external, then we know that we have the ability to overcome and persevere and be resilient. Lest we think that just because we're tested, we're definitely tzaddikim, not so fast. Unless we think we are Rishayim because God is testing us, not so fast, right? Ashrei Adam shehu omed b'nisyono. Fortunate is the man who withstands his test, says the Medrash Rabbah in Shemot. She'ein bria she'ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu menasa ota. There is no creature, certainly no human being, that God doesn't test. And here it says it exactly. The rich person is tested, whether he's going to be generous. I urge everyone at this time, a few days before Yom Kippur, to be generous to the Kol Nidre appeal, our most important fundraiser of the year that enables us to remain the center of Jewish life, providing programming and rabbinic staff and all the things that you know and love about our shul. Please donate to the Kol Nidre appeal. Wealth is a test, but so is poverty. As I mentioned this already, everyone is tested. Just because you're tested, it doesn't make you unique. Just everyone is unique anyway, but it's not because you're tested. Because you're tested, don't think you're a Russia. God's not punishing you. God may be elevating you. And just because you're tested doesn't mean that you're doesn't mean necessarily that you're a tzaddik, but it gives you the opportunity to be a tzaddik. Hashem tzaddik yivchan. The idea that there's a Medrash Tanchuma in Parshat Nitzavim, the fourth source on page 2, that talks about how Jewish continuity has been assured through how we deal with tests, right? The Medrash Tanchuma asked the question, why is it that many other ancient civilizations and peoples, Hittites and Jebusites, they no longer exist, but the Jewish people continue to exist? And the Medrash tells us it has to do with how they respond to Yisurin, how each of them responded to challenges. The Jewish people were resilient and the other nations were not, right? When calamities and catastrophes came to the other nations, they would give up. They'd say, it's over, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we may die. And then they did, whether individually or collectively as a nation. When the Jewish people were tested, they responded, hey, nichnayin and mitpalelin. Towards the end of the second line in that source in Medrash Tanchuma, they would have humility and they would pray, right? In Havdalah, Sarav Yagonemsa V'Shem Hashem Ekra, right? And the time of difficulty comes, and in Tehillim chapter 116, and when difficulty comes, I find myself in difficulty, I call out to God. So Hashem said to them, even though the klolot will be coming, right? The connection between Kitavo and Nitzavim, the parsha of the curses a few weeks ago we read, and the parsha immediately after, the one before Rosh Hashanah of Nitzavim. Because even though the curses come, God assures us that we will be resilient. Hey mamidot etchem, such an important line, second to last line of that source. The curses, the catastrophes, the difficulties, the tests, they don't knock us down, they fortify us. Hein ma'amidot etchem. They fortify us. They allow us to stand. And that's why it tells us, no matter what, even in the face of adversity, you'll be able to stand. And that's why after the curses, what are the next words? Atem nitzavim hayom. You're going to stand. You can make it. God says, I have faith in you. Everyone's tested. If you're tested, you have the ability to pass it. And if not now, then in the future. And that's why even after Kitavo comes Nitzavim, after the Klolot, after what seems like a curse, after what seems like a difficulty and a test, the Jews remain standing, and that is the assurance of the continuity of the Jewish people. Now, hopefully I didn't make tests sound so great that you want to run out and beg God to give you a nisayon. That's not Jewish practice either. The Gemara in Sanhedrin tells us that was King David's mistake. King David said, I want to be like Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. I want to be in the Shmon Esrei, in the first bracha. God says, you weren't tested like that. David says, lay it on me. Give me a test. I'm ready. I'm willing. I'm able. King David gave him the test with Bathsheba. He doesn't exactly pass that test. And we learn from there, don't ask for tests. Because as Chaim Shmulevitz writes, when you are given a test naturally, when it's the will of God, what that means is that you have the innate strength to withstand and to pass and to be resilient. If you ask for a test that wasn't meant for you, you do not have that internal strength, that koach, nor that siyata dishmaya. Part of being tested and being human is to sometimes fail the test. And that's, as I mentioned before, withstanding, being resilient in the face of a test doesn't always mean that you pass, that it's no longer a challenge, although there is that idea of a nekudat havachira rising. Sometimes being resilient is acknowledging and embracing the fact that you failed and not being embarrassed, and not being worried, and not being deflated because you failed, but understanding that failure is part of being human, part of the creation, it's part of the bria, it's part of what it means to be a tzaddik. Let's continue on the source sheet, the Kohelet chapter 7. Ein tzaddik b'aretz asher ya'aseh tov lo yachta. There is no tzaddik that has never sinned. You can understand it to mean the only way you become a tzaddik is if you've undergone struggles and difficulties and challenges. Only after you've sinned in some way or another can there possibly be could it possibly be Could there possibly be righteousness? The fascinating letter of Rav Hutner, letter 128, where he talks about it. We don't have the original letter, but it seems to have been from a student who was struggling with failure, with not accomplishing what he had hoped for, right? And Rav Hutner reassures the student by telling him that we're all worried that we want to reach shleimus. We all want to reach, we all want to be fulfilled. We all want to pass the test. And the problem is, we looked as our examples, the Gedolim, the great rabbis and educators, great men and women of Jewish history that seem to have withstood the test, been resilient, passed with flying colors. And Rav Hutner says it's a shame that we glorify, we write hagiography, we glance over the humanity that really is the story that we should be telling about the Gedolim. It's not about the fact that they became malachim, they were angels. What's unique about Gedolim is that they worked hard and they failed and they had setbacks and they even may have sinned and still they were able to accomplish as much as they did, right? He laments the fact that we tell stories about the greatness of the Chavetz Chaim, that he never spoke Lashon Hara. That's what we're told about the Chavetz Chaim. And we too can be like the Chavetz Chaim, and we feel like there's no way we could be the Chavetz Chaim. We talk way too much Lashon Hara. Rav Hutner says, you got it all wrong. Yeah, there was a time when the Chavetz Chaim reached that level. But you should tell the story of how he struggled, right? Mi yodea min kol hamilchamot hamavikim hamichsholim hanafilot v'anisyonot la'achor shematza Chavetz Chaim v'derech hamilchama shelo im yitzur hara. We don't tell the stories, but they were definitely there, of the struggles and the setbacks and the tension and the turmoil that existed throughout the trials and battles that the Chavetz Chaim must have had with his Yetzer Hara, right? Like I said, the Chavetz Chaim's mother didn't name him the Chavetz Chaim, right? It takes effort. That's what we should tell. That yes, people struggle and people fail, but failure doesn't make you less of a tzaddik. Perhaps the road towards righteousness is paved in failures. Beautiful story about how failure can lead to something much more valuable. A story that I came across about a Picasso painting. There's a Picasso painting out there that was bought. I believe it's called Le Rêve, a painting painted in 1932 by Pablo Picasso. The story goes that it was owned by casino magnate Steve Wynn. And Steve Wynn one day decided to sell this painting to Stephen Cohen, who's now the hedge fund manager, but also a billionaire, owns the Mets. And he decided to sell it for $139 million. And not bad. And right before he sold it, he invited a number of his friends to go up to the office where he kept the painting to give it say goodbye, a farewell to this Picasso. And Steve Wynn has a retina disease that makes it difficult for him to for distance, to tell where things are. And as he was talking and giving a farewell in front of friends up in his office at the casino in Vegas, he elbowed the painting and created a 2-inch hole, 2-inch rip in the painting. The deal with Stephen Cohn was off. It ends up that he got a $90,000 restoration for that 2-inch tear. It was as good as new after the tear. And a few years later, Steve Wynn ended up selling the Picasso that had been torn, that had been ruined, we would have thought, because of the tear, because of the effort to restore. It was sold to Stephen Cohn, the owner of the Mets, a few years later for $155 million this time. $16 million more than Cohn had agreed to before the tear. What we see is sometimes we think a tear comes in our lives, in our painting that is our life, and we think we're done, we're worthless. But if we're resilient, that can repair the tear. And after we repair the tear, not only are we back, but like the second definition of resilience, we're even better, more valuable than we even were before the tear. Rav Tzadok at the bottom of the second page of the source sheet tells us that failure is an essential element of life. Rav Tzadok notes that on Parshat Vayelech, Shabbat Shuva. He notes that it's Moshe Rabbeinu's last day of life, Parshat Vayelech. Tells us, I mentioned on Shabbat morning, Vayelech Moshe, even on his last day of life, he was going and doing and creating and contributing. But the pasuk tells us that Moshe says, I'm going to die. I know I'm going to die. I'm 120 years old. I'm no longer able to go out and come in. Says Rav Tzadok homiletically. You know what this means? Latzeit means to fail. Lavo means to recover from the failure and to be resilient. The moment that Moshe was no longer able, the moment he was no longer able to fail, that's the day of his death. Because where there's life, there's the potential for failure. And if there's no potential for failure, then one's life as we know it is over. That's what Rav Tzadok explains about Moshe Rabbeinu, teaching us that failure is an essential element of life. As part of failure, part of what often accompanies failure is a sense of hopelessness, a sense of yeyush. And Rav Tzadok explains elsewhere that yeyush is the building blocks of the Jewish people. Just when there's hopelessness, when our forefathers felt that all hope was gone, that's when the Jewish people are built. The example he gives is Avram and Sarah. They're 90 and 100 years old. There's no way they can have children. They've completely given up hope. So much so that when Sarah hears it, she laughs. It's at that now, as Rav Tzadok says, if Avram and Sarah were going to have children, let them have children at a normal age, at a younger age, at 40 and 30 years old, right? Why does it have to? Why this miracle? Because, as Rav Tzadok says in the second to last line, Sheyeh binyan ha'umah, the creation of the Jewish people, dafka achar hayeyosh hagamor. Shelo yamin shum adam afilu sar shetifak eidod. Ki zeh kol adam ha'Yisraeli. This is the essence of being Jewish. Lamin shein l'tihayish klal, to never give up, even when there's a tear, even when there's a failure. Understand that failures are part and parcel of creation. Where there's failure, there's life. And when there's life, there's an opportunity to repair. And that, just as that's true on a personal level, that's true on a communal, collective, national level. And we learn that lesson because just when the Avod and Imod, when Avram and Sarah should have given up all hope, they would have been midyayish, there should have been complete yeyush, there should have been complete disillusionment. That's when Yitzchak is born. And that's when the Jewish people continue. Rav Hutner points out in letter 96, we should never judge ourselves in a moment of failure. When we're a failure, we shouldn't evaluate our true worth. Because when we're a failure, when we fail, we really think it's our perspective is skewed. He homiletically says that's the idea that judges can't judge at night. When your view is very pessimistic and forlorn and depressed, that's not the time to judge yourself. Now, you shouldn't judge yourself when you're high up there also, when you feel a sense of arrogance and complete accomplishment. You got to find that golden mean, as the Rambam says. But don't judge at night. Don't judge when you're depressed. Don't judge incorrectly when you think you're at the top of the world. This idea that it is through the failure, through the fall, that we elevate ourselves is found in the pasuk of Yalkut Shimoni on the pasuk in Tehillim, based on a pasuk in Micha. Sorry, Al tisbechi oyavti li kinafalti kamti kishe b'choshech Hashem orli. Do not rejoice over me, O my enemy. Though I have fallen, I rise again. Though I sit in darkness, the Lord is my light. Yalkut Shimoni explains, Ilule shenafalti lo kamti. Had I not fallen, I would not have thrived. Without the failure, I would not have reached the heights that I have. It's like the flax that's tested and that ultimately is better as a result. Ilule sheyashavti b'choshech. Had I not sat in darkness, lo haya orli, I would not have had light. It's through the test. Resilience is not just coming back to where we were, as Sherry Mandel so beautifully says. It's about becoming bigger, tapping into something bigger and better beyond us. And this idea is expressed by Rav Hutner in letter number 141. We're on the third page of the source sheet in the middle of the page. Makor hanisayon, makor shel hitromamut. Test, difficulty, and being resilient in the face of test is the source of elevation. And Rav Hutner in a different letter, letter number 128, tells us where you find the most difficulty, where you find the most reluctance, especially when it comes to midot and avodat Hashem. That's what you should be working on, right? There's no such thing as I'm a tefillah guy, I'm not a tzedakah guy, or I'm a Torah study guy, I don't do chesed. No, where you feel, or I'm always humble, or I can't be humble. No, where you find, I'm not passionate, I'm not an ay guy, I don't get into it. Where you find some reluctance, some friction, says Rav Hutner, but I've seen this in the Vilna Gaon as well. That's what you have to work on. Those are the midot that you need to work on. Adam la'amal yulad. Man was created to toil and to task and to struggle, sometimes to fail, but ultimately work on those areas that seem most difficult to us. And we also know that confidence helps fuel resilience. The pasuk in Nitzavim, again, we go back to Nitzavim, which is always read in Tishra, in Elul, always read before Rosh Hashanah. We're told that the Torah is lo b'shamayim hi, lo me'ever layam hi. It's not on the other side. It's not in heaven. It's not on the other side of the sea. And President of Yeshiva University, Rabbi Dr. Ari Berman, noted that perhaps what's being noted here by Moshe, sort of by hinting, allusion, is that there was once a time when the Torah was in heaven. That's before Matan Torah. And there was once a time when the Torah, compared to where the Jews were located, was Me'ever Layam. That's when the Jews were in Egypt. But Moshe is telling them, we did it. We brought the Torah down from heaven. We got the Torah in Mount Sinai. We left Egypt. We crossed the sea. Look how much we've accomplished. Whatever comes up now, approach it with a can-do attitude, because if we were able to accomplish that, we can accomplish whatever comes our way, even in the face of adversity. I wanted to point out that the lesson of adversity, of resilience, and of passing tests, we saw from the Akedah that's mentioned in Slichot, on Rosh Hashanah and on Yom Kippur. Just wanted to note that the message of resilience is also found in the Sukkah. Beautiful idea I've shared in the past about the Maharal. The Maharal says that an essential message of the Sukkah is resilience. Where do we know this from? The Sukkah is called Sukkot David Hanofalet. It represents the Jewish people, Jewish dynasty, monarchy. What's unique about a sukkah is that even when it's in pieces, it's called a sukkah. If I were to bulldoze my house, all the pieces wouldn't be called my house. They'd be called rubble, or they'd be called wood, or cinder blocks. And if I built a new house with it, they'd be called someone else's house. They lose their association with the original building, the original edifice, once it's destroyed. Not so the sukkah. When you take down the sukkah, you put in your garage, it's a bunch of pieces. Right? It's a wall, it's a lattice, it's a piece of bamboo, it's a wood 2x4. But when you go in the shed or in the garage, and someone asks you, "Hey Alba, what is that? What do I say?" "Oh, that's the sukkah." That's not a sukkah. You can't sit in that on sukkahs. That's the Maharal says, even when it's broken in pieces, the lesson of sukkah is that it remains a sukkah. That there's resilience in the face of when things seem to be coming apart. Just to conclude, we talked about the test of Akedat Yitzchak as being a test of Avram, but it was also a test of Yitzchak. And there's explanations as to why it's referred to as a test of Avram more than Yitzchak. Yitzchak was passive, Avram was active. Yitzchak was meant to be killed. There was a moment Avram had to live with that. Different examples, but perhaps we see the Medrash seems to want us to note the resilience of Yitzchak Avinu in the aftermath of the Akedah, which is learned in the Medrash Haggadol, which I give you. I photocopied a piece at the bottom of the source sheet, and a Pirkei Rav Eliezer about what happens after Yitzchak undergoes this tremendous life-altering test. How does he show resilience? So the Medrash Rabbah says two possibilities. Whereas Avram comes down, there's no mention that Yitzchak comes down. Where's Yitzchak? Heichan Yitzchak. Yitzchak Heichanu. So one explanation is that he's in Gan Eden. The other explanation is that he went to learn in the yeshiva of Shem Ve'ever. In both these cases, remember what Sherry Mandel taught us, that resilience is about connecting with something bigger than ourselves. Yitzchak's resilience is demonstrated in the fact that in the aftermath of this incredible test, he goes to be with Hashem, or in Gan Eden, whatever that means, or he goes to learn in the yeshiva of Shem Ve'ever. He connects with something greater than himself, with Torah, with Hashem. Pirkei Rav Eliezer notes that in the aftermath of the Akedah, that he gets married. He connects with others, right? The most basic mitzvah ben adam lechavero is the relationship between spouses, right? That's what Yitzchak does in the aftermath of the Akedah. He connects with himself through Torah study. He connects with Hashem, ben adam la'atzmo, ben adam la'makom. He connects with a spouse, ben adam la'chavero. That's what we do. That's how we respond to challenges. That's how we are resilient. So my friends, I just want to end by noting that, of course, this is the 20th anniversary of 9/11, but we find ourselves in the midst of a tremendously challenging test. The test of COVID, whether we feel vulnerable on a health level. The world that we are living in now is tested in so many ways. It's not a normal world. It's not a world that we're used to. And we are tested in so many ways. I don't want to go into all the details. I want each of us to think about it ourselves. But the point of our learning today was to recognize that being tested is part of being alive. To fail is part of being alive. It's not a point of shame, it's a point of pride. And listen, nobody asked for the test, but if we're presented with it, it means it was meant for us. And it also means that God has given us the potential, the koach, in order to persevere, in order to be resilient. And I would suggest that we try and be resilient in response to the tests that we experience now in the ways that we saw, by being heroic, by like what Yitzchak did, by connecting with Hashem, especially in the days leading up to Yom Kippur, by connecting with each other, really trying to strengthen and re-strengthen and recreate bonds of fraternity, bonds of brotherhood, bonds of friendship that have been so frayed, that have been so damaged during this last year and a half, and connecting with our precious Torah. If we do this, then please God, we will be resilient. We will grow. We will come back even more valuable after the tear. And Hashem should seal us for a year of health, happiness, success, nachas from our children and grandchildren, peace. Gemar Chatima Tova.